Hello and welcome to Allies, a series of videos where we invite experts to talk about Ukraine, Ukraine's friends, their foreign and domestic policies, and their evolving relationship with Ukraine. Today we'll be talking about the United Kingdom, the country whose military assistance to Ukraine is second to only that of the United States. It provides training, complex weapons, as well as it serves as the advocate of Ukraine. Inside the country, however, there are issues. PM Boris Johnson is departing and after a series of scandals, and the country's economy is strained. Britain is also navigating the alliances in the post-Brexit era, which this war has further complicated. Joining us today to talk about these topics and more is Professor Cheskin, Senior Lecturer in Central and East European Studies at the University of Glasgow. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much.
So, I would like to start this conversation by telling you a little anecdote. Just about 3 weeks ago, I was talking to an old British lady about the war, and basically what she said is that, look, the UK cannot continue supporting Ukraine to the extent it is doing it right now. We have our issues with the economy. And, in general, you can only find articles about Ukraine somewhere after the sports section in the newspapers right now. So do you think that is a fair sentiment? I mean, the war has lasted for 6 months. How important is this issue for the general public?
Yeah, so if you monitor the UK media, then yeah, that's true, right? So the Ukraine stories now are not front page generally. Okay, when we had the strikes in Crimea a few days ago, then it came back to the front page, but that generally there's little information about Ukraine because the situation is not really changing too much, and therefore it's just not in the news anymore. So I think that a lot of British people are kind of lost interest, or it's just become a kind of background noise story, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, but so basically, if kind of something radical happens that kind of brings the attention back, but it very quickly it kind of fades away.
So if there's a big attack somewhere, or if Russia bombs, even Russia can bomb a school or a university, which would have been front page news at the beginning of the war, is now just, I think we've become so desensitized to the stories of Russian aggression, Russian kind of war crimes, for example, that we just don't. There's not the same interest. However, I would say that generally I would generally say there's a high level of sympathy for Ukraine. There's still lots of Ukraine flags flying, in cities across the UK, and so there is that general level of support, but not the same level of interest that there was.
Understood. And what about the politicians? Do you think there's the kind of same amount of attention, the same amount of policy making that was
Yeah.
happening towards the beginning of the war, say?
Well, we need to talk about Boris Johnson, right, first and foremost, because I know he's very popular in Ukraine, and
He is indeed.
yeah. So, and I think he was for Ukraine. I think he was a perfect prime minister. I think he's a terrible prime minister for the British people, but a great prime minister for Ukraine. And the reason is, I think, that he had this idea of himself as a kind of Winston Churchill type of character. And he had this, he wanted to go down in the history books as somebody who defended freedom, did something great and wonderful. And he found it much easier to do that with Ukraine than he did in domestic policy, which he wasn't really focusing on. He got the kind of adoration of the Ukrainian public. Those incredible scenes in Kiev in the early days when he's walking with Zelensky, and it's empty streets, and this Ukrainian sees him and says to him, "You're Boris Johnson," and just can't believe it. And this, it's almost like he was this demigod character, and that was perfect for Boris Johnson. So unfortunately for Ukraine, I don't think that there will be whoever's the next leader, Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, won't be the same, because they won't be so obsessed with their image, with their So I don't think Boris Johnson was necessarily motivated by all of the good things, defending freedom, democracy, halting Russian aggression. I think it was also about his personality, and that was the complex thing there, I think.
Well, Yes, Boris Johnson did become a superstar, and I do remember that video of a man talking, of a man coming up to him in Ukraine. It was quite funny, actually.
Yeah.
Um, but talking about Johnson's successors, you mentioned that it's either Truss or Sunak. So, what can you
Mm.
say about those politicians in regards to how you think they will handle the Ukraine policy, and also what will their domestic priorities be?
Well, okay. So I think across the board in the UK, there's general agreement that the UK needs to support Ukraine. Unlike maybe other countries like Germany and France, similar sized countries in Europe. And there's a number of reasons for that, and it's complicated. But I think generally, even the Labour government, I think under Keir Starmer would support Ukraine. Generally, support the idea of continuing to support militarily Ukraine. However, I think there are definitely limits to that. And with the UK having its own domestic problems right now with inflation, energy prices, yeah, I think there will be a temptation to stop focusing on Ukraine and focusing more on domestic politics. And I think that we'll see that realignment. So my guess, and it's a guess, right? I don't know, is that Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak would continue to support Ukraine in the way that we've supported so far, but there wouldn't be an increase in support for sure, I would guess, right? And it might be a slight decrease in support, but I think it will just continue. The training will continue on British in England of Ukrainian troops, because that's politically, that's not a problem, and it's not too expensive. They'll send a steady stream of ammunition and weapons, and I think that will just continue now, that sort of steady pace.
Okay, but I want to press you a little more here. So, is there really any difference between kind of what we can expect from Sunak and Truss? Like, are they really
Yeah.
as
If you in so they're both campaigning at the moment, right, to become the next Tory leader, and so there's been lots of high-profile television debates between them, and the issue of Ukraine is just a non-issue right now, which is really interesting. For Boris Johnson, it was the big issue, right? He was using it for his own purposes. He was very helpful to kind of divert attention from his domestic failures. But neither Rishi Sunak nor Liz Truss are talking about Ukraine in a substantial way. So that in itself gives us a clue that they just don't prioritize it the same way as Boris Johnson.
Yeah, well, maybe, I do agree with you that the domestic issues are going to come to the forefront, but, you can also kind of interpret it in a way that, if they're not talking about it, this does mean, like you said, that there's kind of
Yeah.
overwhelming agreement on this topic anyway.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that's why I think it will the support will just continue without making headlines, right? I wouldn't expect any big new deals, that the UK would suddenly give Ukraine some equipment, kind of high technologically advanced equipment, above and beyond what they've done. Maybe I'm wrong. Liz Truss is very difficult to pin down because she changes her mind all the time. She says one thing, she says another. She doesn't really appear to have a very clear position on almost anything, let alone Ukraine. Rishi Sunak, of course, he was in the government, so he was part of the kind of Boris Johnson government. So he's been supporting Ukraine. I would guess, again, a guess, that Rishi Sunak would be probably a slightly stronger supporter of Ukraine, because I think Liz Truss could change her mind much quicker. That's what we've seen from her politically. So if I was a Ukrainian, I would probably prefer Rishi Sunak. Although I think Liz Truss will become the next prime minister.
That's an interesting point. I was
Right.
just gonna ask you about who do you think is gonna win, but yes, it does look like Liz Truss is leading in the
Yeah.
polls. Um, Going back to Johnson, I think it would be beneficial for our Ukrainian audience to learn about why he had to leave. Because, like you said, yes, he is extremely popular in Ukraine,
Mhm.
but probably well, increasingly unpopular, let's put it this
Yeah.
way, in the UK. So can you tell us the kind of the full story here?
Yeah, as somebody who studies, pays close attention to Ukraine, I see these two faces of Boris Johnson. This, face of this person defending freedom, which is, I think Boris Johnson's finest moments were definitely in Ukraine and dealing with Ukraine. I think that's definitely his finest moments, and his worst moments are everything he's done in the UK. And this is this, and of course, for the average British voter who knows relatively little about Ukraine, they watch what's happening in the news, then it's much harder to see that good side of Boris Johnson, because in the UK, the services we have, health service, dental care, schools, all these things are really under strain, and people are really noticing it. You can't, even an ambulance is taking hours to arrive in people's houses. Accident and emergency centres in hospitals are completely overrun. My daughter, she has real problems with her teeth, and there's a 12-month waiting list to see a dentist, right, an NHS dentist. Now in Ukraine, I have Ukrainian friends. In Ukraine, you can see a dentist tomorrow, right? So this is the strange paradox of, obviously not in the occupied territories, strange paradox comparing Ukraine, and Ukraine's a war zone under things, and yet things work sometimes that we might not expect. In the UK, a very rich country in peace, things are not working, and so people are angry. And then there was all his partying during lockdown. So he tells people you have to self-isolate. He's caught having parties in 10 Downing Street with alcohol, lots of people gathered together. So there's a lot of anger towards Boris Johnson and his inactions, I would say.
That's very understandable. I guess for now, let's move away from the kind of high-profile names and learn a bit more about the UK's political deep state, so to speak. Before the war, UK was basically supporting Ukraine in terms of military aid, for example, by means of ANLAWs and other assistance, when many of the other countries weren't. Was it that the UK evaluated Ukrainian resilience, Ukraine resistance potential differently, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have all the knowledge of this, but from what I read and understand, because the UK armed forces were helping train Ukrainians, I've read lots of reports from British army personnel, and at the start, the idea was that they were NATO trained, right? They knew everything, and they were going to teach the Ukrainians. And then I think many people found that actually the Ukrainian armed forces started teaching the Brits lots of things. And they realized, wait a minute, this Ukrainian army, it actually has a great deal of expertise, because they've been fighting war in the Donbass region since 2014, right? So there's lots of combat experience. They were kind of well motivated, and the reforms have been actually incredibly successful since 2014. And I think that impressed the British armed forces, the people who dealt with the Ukrainians, and maybe that level of contact helped instill some level of trust in Ukrainian armed forces. I'm sure it did. And I think additionally, there's always a sense in the UK compared to France and Germany, the three kind of biggest players in Western Europe, at least. There's a sense of mission, right? That the UK kind of has this similar idea to the USA, that we need to defend freedom, right? We need to be proactive, and it isn't always good, like Iraq, but it's, in this case, I think it obviously was a much more positive example of the UK trying to assert influence and defend freedoms. So I think an identity type of issue is important,
Certainly, I think one thing that's interesting, like you said, that there are professional Ukrainian troops who are really good, but I think it's important to keep in mind that kind of right now it's a much bigger kind of military that Ukraine is doing with it. I mean, the UK also, if they, well, they were predicting that the war would start along with the Americans. They were kind of one of the two loud voices. So they were probably also accounting that it's not just going to be those people who are really good. It's also going to be, more poorly trained new recruits.
For sure. And I think the intelligence issue is important there, right? The UK and the US intelligence has not always been great. And the Iraq War is a kind of perfect example of that. But in this case, it looks like whether it was the US or the UK intelligence, the intelligence was good. They obviously had people in Russia who were feeding back information to them at various levels, which is obviously very impressive. And I think the UK and the US obviously work very closely together, have been very close allies, and probably shared a lot of their intel. And I think that was a major factor here as well.
I do agree with you. It was quite impressive. I mean, they got the date of the invasion like plus minus a week. I mean, that's just amazing. I wanted to ask you something that you briefly mentioned before. Is that UK, France, and Germany are sort of the the top three dogs in Western Europe. Why did Britain choose to support Ukraine kind of more forcefully, and Germany and France stayed out? How do you view this kind of discrepancy?
Well, I think it's a kind of state identity. France and Germany have always tried to negotiate, tried to talk. When it was promised that Ukraine would, in the famous Budapest NATO summit, that Ukraine would eventually be a NATO member, France and Germany were dead against this idea, right? Because they believe in kind of a more friendly approach to Russia. And the Germans especially had thought that we can negotiate with Russia. We can treat them like a rational actor. If we trade with them, it will increase our ability to have leverage, and it will increase, chances of democratization. Of course, that was wrong. We fundamentally have to say that the German approach was absolutely wrong and very problematic. But they thought it at the time, right? They genuinely believed it. And Macron, right up to the start of the invasion, he genuinely thought that he could convince Putin to stop the invasion, through diplomacy. And diplomacy with the UK, Russia-UK diplomacy had been bad for years. There was the Litvinenko poisoning, there was the Skripal poisoning. There was a series of incidents that meant that diplomatic relations were almost rock bottom. So from the UK perspective, there was no chance. They just didn't ever believe that you could talk to Putin and convince him, which proved to be correct. Sometimes I think it's luck. If you have a position and it turns out to be true, it's sometimes just because it's luck, right? Another leader might have been different, who knows? But definitely the approach was very different to the Germans and the French in that respect.
So would you say that this approach kind of also propelled the UK to be an active advocate for Ukraine on the diplomatic front? I understand your larger point about the UK, but who are the hawks, at least on the diplomatic front, in the UK?
Yeah, it's a strange thing because under the Boris Johnson government, there weren't too many hawks, right? It was led mostly by Boris Johnson as the person speaking out, but there was general kind of murmurs and ideas from politicians that we should support Ukraine, and that especially became clear once the battle for Kiev had failed from the Russians, when the Ukrainians had defended those positions at great cost, and we saw the horrible things in Bucha and other places. And then people realized, wait a minute, this Russian army is terribly organized. The Ukrainians are putting up a really good fight. There's a chance that the Ukrainians could actually defend themselves and even push the Russians out. And people started to change. But there weren't kind of those hawkish voices so much. It was a kind of very different to maybe the USA, where you would expect those those hawks, it was a kind of general understanding. And there were a few voices who spoke out against it, right? So Jeremy Corbyn, who is, the former Labour leader, he is one of the people who says, we need to get peace, we need to negotiate for peace. And I think he would be in favour of drawing a line under the Donbass region now and saying, well, we can kind of give that to the Russians if we can get peace. In my opinion, of course, a very naive position. So there were these voices on the left, mostly, who thought we should do that. But generally, everyone else accepted that it was fine to support Ukraine.
Certainly. You did mention that there was kind of a relatively high opinion of the UK personnel of Ukrainian troops. I'm wondering, what was the consensus in the UK with regards to Russian soft power in Ukraine? And, this goes kind of beyond just media. Perhaps it has to do also with intelligence. We had another colleague from Latvia that we talked to who said that there were concerns that there were basically Russian spies in Ukrainian security agencies. But also, yes, with regards to the media, how does the UK evaluate Ukrainian resistance in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, it's a more complicated issue, and I think people in the UK have less knowledge about that. General public have no idea, and of course, at the level of the general public, I think it's starting to change. But until fairly recently, people had very little knowledge about Ukraine. They didn't know, are Ukrainians pro-Russian? Some questions that people might think, because they often speak Russian. So there's always this problem of conflating people who speak Russian and people who are pro-Russian, as you know, right? So, but I think that at the governmental levels of people working on policy, specialists on Russia and Ukraine, I think they understood very well, much better than the Russians, actually, that the kind of developments in Ukrainian identity were definitely moving towards a consolidation of anti-Russian feeling, of a kind of consolidated Ukrainian identity, with pockets of people in certain areas who, of course, were more nostalgic for the Soviet Union or even pro-Russian, but they were pockets. And when I've spoken to Russian colleagues about this, I have been amazed how little knowledge they have of Ukraine, considering their neighbors, considering they have this history, a terribly bloody history, but a history of being in the same state, etc. Hardly knew anything about Russia's influence, and vastly overestimated Russia's influence in terms of soft power. So I don't think that in the UK that was the case. I think people understood that it had clear limits on soft power, and where it succeeded, it was things like infiltrating the secret services and the intelligence services. There is widespread feeling that in Ukraine, of course, there are many people who are pro-Russian who have infiltrated the intelligence services.
I mean, yeah, it's amazing how much Russia miscalculated in this regard. And all they had to do is to look at the data from Democratic Initiatives Foundation found on our website, where you could see some trends going on.
Yeah.
But I want to pivot towards the UK's economy a bit. So you already mentioned, right, that there are some issues with the provision of public services. So, and obviously we read a lot of articles about kind of the UK having economic issues. So would you say that it's really the economy, or would you say that it's really the provision of public services? Because those are, a bit different, or maybe it's both. Just want to kind of have a more precise understanding of that.
It's both. And every person's social, it depends economic group you're in, it might be different. So, for example, in my position, I'm in a relatively secure socioeconomic position. The lack of services affects me immediately, right? And I see it, and I worry about it. But if I was in a lower socioeconomic bracket, then might lead to a lack of, ability to buy food, for example.
My question, I guess, following this up is what are the reasons why the economy is struggling, and does the war have something to do with it?
Well, the war has something to do with it. Brexit has a lot to do with it. And we're starting, the pandemic kind of diverted attention from the effects of Brexit, which we are now feeling in terms of inflation. In all of the kind of G7 economies, the UK is expected to have the highest inflation. And that is for a number of reasons, but Brexit is one of the biggest reasons because obviously it costs more now for us to import, and we import so much of our food and products that it's much more expensive to import those. In terms of energy, we are not in the same position as Germany or Italy in being dependent on Russian gas, which is why it's surprising that our energy prices are so high. And many people are very angry because the energy companies appear to be making record profits at the same time as the consumer is having to pay almost double in energy prices. So lots of people are very angry at the lack of regulation of our energy companies, our water companies as well right now. And I think that's another reason why people are angry at the Conservative government, the lack of regulation of that. And when we look, is not as bad. And yet we hardly any Russian gas was imported.
Another economy related question that I have for you is about the sanctions that the UK imposed on Russia. How would you evaluate those?
I think you can see them from two perspectives. On the one hand, the sanctions went much further than Russia expected. After the 2014 annexation of Crimea, there were looking back, it was a huge mistake not to have much more rigid sanctions regime against Russia in 2014. The sanctions were very weak, so I think Russia thought that they could get away with it. So the sanctions have been much stronger across the board. When people say sanctions aren't working in Russia, I disagree. I think sanctions are working, but they work slowly. So the effects of the sanctions are starting to be felt. And in the long term, I think it will really harm Russia's economy. The problem is, if you're in Moscow right now, okay, there's McDonald's have left and IKEA, you can't buy IKEA furniture, but things are kind of moving in the same way, right? It looks kind of like the same as it did in 2008 when you had inflation, when you had an economic downturn. And Russians are used to that kind of level of boom and bust in their economy. But in the long term, I think it will have a really big effect. I think more should be done. I think we should be pulling every single lever we can to put economic pressure on Russia. And that should be sanctioning every single individual. Russian banks are able to bypass the sanctions, some of them. They're importing goods from Kazakhstan now. How can we stop that? Very difficult to stop them doing that. So I think the sanction. I think we'll give the kind of sanctions a C plus. I would, maybe a B minus. They are effective. They are going to be effective in the long term, relatively effective, but we could do more, definitely.
Well, it's kind of a good news, bad news situation because yes, there's more that can be done, but also there's more that can be done. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Pivoting to the kind of foreign policy section of the UK of this conversation, I want to open up with kind of a big question, and maybe you hinted towards the answer earlier, but I just kind of want to nail it down. We kind of live in the age when a lot of countries are kind of seeking a return to their historical selves. Maybe Brexit was part of that. For the Kremlin, it's kind of the land gathering paradigm. For Ukraine, it's the fighting a centuries-long enemy. So does the UK have this kind of historical image, or an image that it kind of aspires to be in modern Europe?
Well, yes and no. The UK is in a strange position in terms of its post-imperial identity, because on the one hand, I think some people have got used to the fact that Britain is not the world power it used to be, and we understand that, and even we were taking a kind of back seat behind Germany and France, before the re-invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. I think it was clear that the UK had played a minor role in diplomacy with Ukraine and Russia, with the Minsk agreements. And it was quite striking that the UK had been essentially absent from those discussions. And I don't think most people really paid that much attention. I think the Brexit issue was more important. So it seemed like this imperial identity of kind of great power status, or whatever we called it for Britain, right? This kind of being the pride in Britishness, was played out in a more domestic level, as opposed to a foreign policy level, which is obviously very different to Russia, where it was all about the absolute opposite. Domestically nothing was going on, and so there was a chance to push for Putin to try and gain popularity by reigniting the kind of imperial project of Russia.
Well, I guess now, having answered that question, I want to go through a couple of relationships the UK has with countries all over the world. You mentioned about Britain's imperial past. So my first question would be, how have things gone with India after the war started? It's been having a mostly neutral position, but it's also been helping Moscow in many ways. So how is the UK talking to India, and has that conversation changed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about that issue myself. I know that hasn't really been a news issue in the media, right? That India obviously has, in many respects, gained something from this war, because it's made Russia a weak partner that's desperate to sign contracts on terms that are more favorable to India than they would have been if Russia had not re-invaded Ukraine. So certainly the Indian position is very pragmatic, and kind of pushing aside values and considerations about Ukrainian sovereignty and the lives of Ukrainians. I'm sure that at a diplomatic level, the UK is trying to push India. The UK-India relationship is complicated because obviously that imperial past, right? So there's a level of distrust from the Indian side. When the UK, there's a sense that the UK can't really lecture India after having occupied it for so long and exploited its economy for a long period of time. So it's not in the best position to try to lecture India about anti-imperialism. You can see the kind of absurdity of that position. So generally, I think it's kind of an issue that's relatively low key. I'm sure the diplomats are trying to make agreements and convince them, but yeah, definitely it goes under the radar.
Certainly. So, what about the relationship between UK and the EU? Has the war had any impact on that? Obviously, Brexit was a big event for these a bloc in a country. But has the war further distanced the two?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think in many people's minds, there's always people who support Brexit always see the EU as ineffective, as kind of unable to make important political decisions. And I think that will be reinforced by the actions or inactions of Germany and France, especially for people who watch this, because there's a sense that I think in certain circles, there's a sense of pride that Britain is supporting Ukraine more than the other European allies, especially NATO allies. Of course, the Baltic states and Poland are very supportive of Ukraine, obviously, but they're much smaller economies and have less military aid to give. So I think there is a disappointment that the major EU partners haven't done more. On the other hand, I think that reinforces Britain's image of a kind of coming back to major world politics and playing a major role. And going back to Boris Johnson, I think that was good for him and his image, something he really cared about. But generally, I don't think it's seen as an EU issue. I think I don't think that's part of the calculations of most people. Right? The Ukraine war, Russia's war against Ukraine, is seen as something that is distinct from EU issues. And so the only difference, I think, is the cost of energy, which, of course, the war affects. I don't know if people really understand how that and to what extent it was already going to be an issue. So I think it's a very muddy and complicated issue. And the current politicians, the Conservatives, they don't want anything to be associated with Brexit. So they try to convince people that, at the port of Dover going to France, that's not to do with Brexit, that energy prices, that food prices are not to do with Brexit. So they try to convince people it's not completely separate from the EU issues.
So has the war overall changed any kind of major priorities of the British foreign policy? If you could give us kind of the top three foreign policy priorities for United Kingdom before the war and after the war?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I think it has changed in terms of, there's always been a debate about whether, how much the UK should spend on defense. And when we've got real big problems in terms of services, then people say, we shouldn't spend, for example, Trident. We have this Trident nuclear submarine and it costs billions of pounds. And many people say, well, we shouldn't spend that on Trident. We should spend it on healthcare or education or something. And I think the Ukraine war will convince many people that it was correct to spend that money on things like Trident. So I think that's one thing that the war has done. And it will convince people that we should continue to invest heavily, a significant proportion of GDP on our military infrastructure. And I think so that's one, maybe a major kind of way that the war will affect people's perceptions of foreign policy. In terms of other priorities, I don't, the Brexit issue, I don't think Ukraine really changes that at all. And it's very difficult. You ask for three, pre-war and three post-war priorities. But the nature of the Conservative government has been such that it's very difficult to find those priorities because Boris Johnson was a populist. He didn't really give us his clear vision, right? His vision was a very poetic vision, almost like Donald Trump's vision in Make America Great Again. It lacked substance. It sounded good. Boris Johnson is a great orator. He's a great charismatic leader. He's a showman who is able to present these wonderful images without having to then pin down what it looks like. So I don't know exactly. I think the US-UK kind of axis, I think, has been reignited, perhaps, given extra impetus. That's always been a priority. And I think that's been cemented. Sometimes it goes through ups and downs, but I think that is a clear case that we need to be very closely allied with the US. And that works in the favor of the Brexiteer kind of narrative. It says, our closest partner in terms of foreign policy is the USA, right? The country that really understands what we do, what we're trying to do is the USA. So it makes sense to align ourselves with them rather than France and Germany, who are seen as impotent and weak in terms of decision making. So that is another area I would point to. But I can't really point to too many other issues. Trade agreements, of course, but Ukraine doesn't really play a part in that, I don't think. And maybe there'll be a move to renegotiate some of the Brexit agreements, which are not working very well. And again, I don't think Ukraine changes too much, apart from the energy price issue.
I do agree with you that Boris Johnson's approach was hectic, including in foreign policy. And I think one testament to that, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, is kind of the numerous agreements that were signed. For example, there was a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and the UK, and there was also a trilateral agreement between Ukraine, Poland, and the UK. So what has happened to these initiatives, if anything? Have they just kind of faded and just been replaced by a new thing, which is, helping Ukraine militarily?
Yeah, so I need to look into that. But yes, Boris Johnson was keen to get these moments when he could be, photographed signing agreements, and he loved going to, to Kiev and meeting Zelensky because it was this great photo opportunity. But yeah, it appears that the military support that the UK gives to Ukraine appears to be negotiated kind of on an ad hoc basis. Ben Wallace, the defense secretary, who actually I think is one of the better more professional conservative politicians, I think has been working in a kind of in a less bombastic way, in a less kind of in a way that politicians work these days, like Boris Johnson, and has been working behind the scenes, just to talk to the Ukrainians, say, what do you need, and then think, well, this is what the Ukrainians want, this is what we have, what can we realistically give them, and I think it's been working on that basis, kind of, okay, maybe now we can release these, maybe we need to, be a bit careful here. And I think it's a kind of pragmatic relationship in that respect.
We only have a couple questions left, really, and all of them talk about the war, the military aid. So that's where I would like to start. The UK spending on the military and kind of the production capacity is pretty strong. I know that you mentioned that there are kind of debates about how strong it should be, but it's fairly strong at the moment. So can we say that there's an interest among the representatives of the military-industrial complex and kind of their influence on the government to keep supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, you can see there are huge positives, if we can use that word. It's a bad word because Ukrainians are dying, but there are huge positives for the military industrial complex, because a lot of the equipment can be really tested and used without British lives being lost. So as you know, right, Ukrainians are doing the hard work and sacrificing. They're increasingly using Western technology, but it's Ukrainian lives that are being lost. And there's also an idea, I think, that if we've invested all this money into this equipment, at the moment it's just sitting in warehouses or wherever in the UK. It makes much more sense to use it. Right, the whole purpose of this military investment is to defend freedom, and it's not being used if it's sitting within our island of Great Britain. So, of course, we should give it to the Ukrainians who are able to use it to those means. So I think that definitely is the case, and I think we are all learning a lot about modern warfare. Right, I think the conflicts in the Russians in Syria. We thought we learned something about the Russian army, but we didn't. We did, but we didn't learn enough because it was so one-sided, and the Russian equipment looked good, and the Russian army looked relatively professional. But as soon as they met a strong adversary, as soon as they came up against modern technology, they didn't look anything like they did in Syria. So, from the military perspective, they are learning a huge amount from this conflict. They're learning about their own equipment. They're learning about what needs to be, what types of equipment we need to invest in the future. So I absolutely would think that they would 100% support giving the equipment to Ukraine, because from their perspective, there are only benefits. But like I say, it's a horrible benefit because the Ukrainians are dying as we speak, unfortunately.
It is true. There is obviously this Russian narrative that this is the war to the last Ukrainian, and the Ukrainians are doing the brunt of the job. But there was one interesting report that I saw recently that was basically talking about how the problem of the Ukrainian military is, that it doesn't have enough training and enough guns. But it has a lot of people, a lot of motivated people. Something, for example, that Russia has, that Russia doesn't have.
Yeah.
So you would say that there's both the kind of the political will and the assets to provide both the training and the necessary equipment.
Yes, but yeah, I do think so. But everything has a limit, because I think from the military perspective, they're willing to give away to Ukraine equipment. I think there's a level of trust. Look, if we give this equipment to Ukraine, it will be used professionally. The Ukrainians will do it really well. We can train them. They've proven to be excellent, in the battlefield. But there's also a sense that we need to we can't give everything away, right? The UK needs to preserve a certain amount of this equipment on UK shores for whatever reason in the future. Who knows what we need it? So I think there's just that limit, right? So and there is the danger of further escalation, which I think for Ukrainians is hard to understand, right? Because escalation for Ukrainians is hard to imagine. How can it be more escalated? The people in Ukraine are being bombed every day. The city of Mariupol doesn't really exist anymore. Shops, houses, hospitals bombed daily. Kharkiv, the poor people of Kharkiv, they're being bombed literally every day. So the word escalation makes no sense. But from the British perspective, it makes sense because it's nuclear escalation and the fear that this would reach us, right? So there is a sense that, and the same with the Americans, that yes, they will give the support to Ukraine, but they don't want attacking, into the Russian territory. I think Crimea is, acceptable because it's seen as Ukrainian territory, of course, but the other parts that Russia occupies in its own borders, they don't want really that escalation. So there is a fear, I think, and I think the Ukrainians, for their professionalism, there's a fear that the Ukrainians will go further than we would do because they are defending themselves, because there's of course a lot of hatred towards Russia now, and there's a feeling that Ukraine should go after Russia in Russian territory. So I think that's been Ukrainian partners to try and get reassurances that this equipment will be used in the territories of Ukraine and the occupied territories of Ukraine and not further. I think that's the big issue.
Certainly. So you're basically saying that one, there's kind of a quantity program. The UK doesn't want to deplete its stockpiles, but two, there's a quality problem. It doesn't want to escalate. But do you think that kind of with time, these limits of escalation will be pushed? I mean, we 6 months ago, it would be hard to imagine kind of this level of supplies that we have right now. Will this be further pushed, or will this be kind of slowed down?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the war, there was a fear that even supplying Ukraine with, manpads or whatever would have been seen as an escalatory issue for Russia. But we have not seen evidence of that. And I think the idea increasingly is that Russia responds to weakness, right? If you show weakness, Russia will take as much as it can, and it only respects strength. This is now starting to be a cliche, but it appears to have some, basis to it. So there's a sense that we can't be soft on Russia. So the idea is we need to get to that line, as close to that line as we can get, of being hard on Russia without escalating. And I think that line has moved from many policymakers in Britain, right, of what we can do. So I think at the moment it is, yes, Ukraine has the right to defend itself within its territory, and Russia probably won't escalate, right? I think the fear of nuclear escalation has gone down. There's still that fear. I think it's a real fear, right? I think it's justified, but I think the fear has gone down. Yes.
One thing or one program beyond the supply of weapons that the UK has really helped Ukraine with was the training provided, which is currently supported by several countries. How did this idea come about, and why was it Britain that chose to kind of host this large
Yeah.
training facility?
Well, I don't know. I don't, I wasn't part of that thing, but I know that, the UK army have been training Ukrainians for a long time, and Ukrainians have been, they've been back and forth, right? It hasn't just been Brits going to Ukraine; it's been Ukrainians coming to Britain. I think the obvious answer is that it would only be the USA and the UK who have, out of the allies who are supporting Ukraine, who have the capacity to do this and the willpower. And I think the UK is just the obvious choice geographically, right? Rather than sending Ukrainians all the way to the States, let's base them in the UK. It's a safe place, where they have these facilities, and they're just absolutely happy to do that. And I think, again, that's part of that pragmatic relationship with the Ministry of Defence, with Ben Wallace and people like this, who clearly saw that this was an area they could help Ukraine with minimum cost. It costs something, but it's not a huge amount of money, and that Britain could take a leading role, and it has, of course. And as you say, other European allies have come in and provided their own support, their own training support in the UK. So I think it was that was a simple decision that made sense. I think for Germany or France, if Germany and France had done this, I think it would have been politically much less popular. And Scholz, we've seen Scholz. He goes back and forth, and he says one thing, and the German public aren't as supportive of arming Ukraine, defending Ukraine. The British public are much more happy with this. So it was a non-issue, right? It wasn't a big issue. In Germany, it might have been a big issue. People might have protested against it. Who knows? In the UK, just people accepted it immediately, that this was normal, this was a good thing, and that we were happy for this to happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, I think it's really overlooked oftentimes just how important training is, because it's one thing to defend and have the weapons to defend, and it's a whole other thing to attack and have the skills to attack.
Yeah.
And
that's why people often say we need to send more heavy weaponry to Ukraine. Of course, I agree with that, but people need to be trained. HIMARS, we talk about HIMARS a lot now, but we had to train Ukrainians how to use those systems, high-tech systems, and it appears that they've been trained very fast and very, very quickly. They've been very quick to learn, which has been incredible. But so, yeah, I think that in many respects, the training is as important as some of the equipment that's sent to Ukraine. Yeah.
You learn fast when you have to,
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you're motivated. Yeah.
So, we've covered a lot of topics today. We talked about, Boris Johnson and other politicians. We talked about weapons supplies. We talked about foreign policy. With all that in mind, and this is kind of why I saved this question towards the end of the conversation, I want to ask you, is there a vision by the UK, sort of by the politicians, by the kind of, the more deep state people like Ben Wallace, by the media, a vision of the end of the war, how this is going to end? Is there a strategy behind this vision?
Yeah, I think it changes. And so after the Battle for Kiev, when the Russians were kind of pushed back, there was a sense, right, we have a real opportunity now to basically destroy the Russian army, right? Which is definitely something that the UK would welcome. And Ukraine can maybe, we thought, wow, Ukraine might win this war. This is incredible against all the odds. As the war has now reached a kind of plateaued period where it's kind of relative stalemate at the moment, and there's a sense it's a long game, right? That if Ukraine wins this, it won't be quick. It will have to slowly bleed the Russian army, and we will have to slowly bleed the Russian economy. And I think so. We're moving to this different phase now, and that's why I think there's a sense that we don't need to send as much equipment, military equipment. We just need to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose its positions, which it's holding at the moment. We don't know what will happen in the Kherson counteroffensive, whether that will occur and when. For as long as Ukraine doesn't lose its position, the Russian army will not be able to sustain itself for indefinitely because it's losing men, it's not recruiting fast enough. The people who are recruited are terribly trained. The equipment is being sent is now old Soviet tanks that is just not top level. So I think the idea might be this slow victory for Ukraine. But I think the vision is, for many people, a total victory for Ukraine, which would be not just going back to the borders, the de facto borders of February 24th, but actually pushing Russians out of Crimea, which I think is an incredible thing that we wouldn't ever have thought about at the beginning of the war. I think that's the vision, but I think there's a pragmatic position as well that they would, if we can push the Russians back, even back to the February 24th positions, that would be something to look to try to achieve. But I think there's a sense that yes, we can achieve that.
So the retaking of Crimea is kind of being normalized because I see it a lot in the Ukrainian discourse, but I actually didn't think that it's getting normalized in discourse abroad.
You have to understand that the discourse is not public, right? Because there's no gains to be made. In the Ukrainian case, there are gains to be made for Zelensky to give people hope that Ukraine will win, that Ukraine won't stop at Kherson, that it won't stop at the borders of Crimea, that it will go all the way and regain the whole of Ukrainian territory. But there's no political gains for that in the UK. So any politician wouldn't say that because it doesn't do anything. It might make the Russians angry, but that's it. So I think this is the sense I get from reading military analysts, British-based military analysts, and people who write about that. But it's definitely not a public discourse. I don't think there's been any effort to tell the British public what we hope for in the outcomes for this war and what we're trying to support.
Okay, that makes sense. And for the last question, I want to ask you the following. Do you think that there's somehow a chance that things will kind of come to the pre-war world order? Is there a scenario where the West would be willing to engage with Russia that is led by Putin? And I think, this question is particularly relevant given that, as you notice, the war is getting slower, the escalation is kind of decreasing, this first shock is kind of decreasing. So, can things really go back?
No, and I hope not, right? Because I think there's, in the UK, definitely, and I wish that Germany was more like this in this respect. There is an absolute mistrust of Putin, which of course is, you as a Ukrainian understand that, and it must be very frustrating for Ukrainians why anybody would ever think that you could give a peace deal to President Putin, because we know what he does. He had a peace deal after 2014, and he just invaded Ukraine again. Why won't he re-invade? And I think that's understood by most people at least in political leadership positions here. There's this lack of trust. So I think most people think that there would need to be a complete change in Russian leadership, maybe even in the nature of the Russian state before we started to trust Russia. I sincerely hope that sanctions, even if the war has a kind of peace deal, whatever that might look like, I sincerely hope that sanctions would not be lifted until Russia radically reformed. And that would, I mean radically, right? There would have to be huge changes. And even if, because Medvedev was president and he looked like a liberal, he was part of a liberal. He was an actor, it turns out, right? But he pretended to be a liberal. And there could be another Russian president who pretends to be a liberal in the future. The same policy is, in the military investments, if the same kind of lack of freedoms for press, for NGOs, the key has to be a more democratic Russia. That's the key.
I agree with you, and I think our listeners do too. And to our listeners, if you want to watch more interviews like this, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and follow the videos that we're releasing. I'll remind you that talking to us today was Professor Cheskin. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure.